Good morning to everybody. Good afternoon. I am truly humbled by all the speakers that spoke here this morning. And it is extremely wonderful to see the advocacy and the advocates who are at work in order to make life and make changes that could empower persons with disabilities, because we do know that we need it in the Caribbean. And you've heard a lot about the importance of equity for health education. But we also need to think about equity in education as well. And that's where my work is centered. So this is why this morning I'm looking at promoting equity in education for children with intellectual disabilities. And just to say, part of my work, or a lot of my work, has really centered around this idea that it is really necessary for education and for educators to be really aware that the diversity that sits in front of you in the classroom is simply a manifestation of differences between and among students. And that's a key message that the research community is getting out there. And it's about changing stereotypes, changing labels, and definitely moving away from labels to think about who sits in front of you in the classroom, and what do you as an educator, what do you have the capacity to do? And understanding that you can teach the students who sit in front of you, regardless of the nature of the disability or the diversity that you're seeing in the classroom. So you've heard a lot about inclusion, you've heard it mentioned. But what is it and what is the origins of it? And the origins of this term inclusion comes from UNESCO, and in 2005, UNESCO suggested that inclusion is a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all learners. And through what? Through increasing participation in learning, cultures, and community. And I think that's what you heard the speakers talk about, the importance of community, the importance of culture and changing cultures. And so that within schools, we're looking at modifying content, approaches, structures, and strategies, all within the purview of teachers and schools to change. So, as we heard from the last speaker, it is within our hands, our process. And as Barack Obama keeps saying, you know, we are the change we've been waiting to see. And teachers, that's the message that I want you to take away. You are the change that these children have been waiting to see. UNESCO's revised definition in 2017 spoke of inclusion as a philosophy and a policy and a process that helps overcome barriers. Barriers to access, barriers to participation of all students in their learning regardless of diversity. So the principles, and you've seen this already in another presentation earlier, but apply to health. The principles that govern inclusion are the same across the board: fairness, equity, equality, sameness or equivalence, social justice, which looks at the distribution of advantages and disadvantages within society. And we always say that schools are a microcosm of society, and we need to look at those balances of advantages and disadvantages. And most of all, diversity, recognizing the range of capacities and differences among students. And notice That definition didn't say abilities, because there are some problems with ability labeling. We rely on it in the Caribbean, but one of the fundamental flaws about relying on notions of abilities is that it implies that it is one, permanent, and that there are some students who can and who do not have the ability to do. Capacity is limitless. And therefore, it suggests that all students can, once they're given the right types of environment, once the structures are there to support, the accommodations are there, they have the capacity to learn, to grow. The potential is there. So when we think about what does international law suggest about this thing called inclusion, and I'm going to show you that beyond the Convention of the Rights for Persons with Disabilities, there is really solid foundation in terms of international law for inclusion. And we have here on screen the Convention for the Rights of the Child. And in particular, there are 3 articles that really speaks to what we want children to enjoy. And so Article 12, it says that states parties shall assure the child who is capable of forming his or her views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child. And we saw that this morning with Nicole Flynn, the way she expressed herself. And that's something that she talked about. She wanted to be seen as a person, self-determination. She did not want to be invisible. And this is something that we need to take on board. How to give our students voice and a sense of agency about what they're doing, experiencing, and participating in at school. Article 23 considers children with disabilities and their right to services and education to help them achieve that inclusion that we want them to have. And then Article 29 states that the purpose of education is to develop the personality, talents, capabilities to their fullest potential. And then we have the 1919 World Declaration for All. And at that time, there were about 1 billion illiterate persons in the world. 6 of those were children. And the conference set increasing school enrollment as the agenda to help rectify the imbalance. And moving on from there, we have the 1994 Salamanca Declaration. Among all the declarations that you're going to hear about, this one has the clearest expression for inclusion. And it noted that every child has unique characteristics, interests, quote unquote, abilities, and learning needs. And those with special education needs must have access to regular schools which should accommodate them with a child-centered pedagogy capable of meeting those needs. And in particular, the Salamanca framework is extremely important because it recognizes that the place that these children should be educated is within the regular education setting, challenging that notion that the best place to educate children with disabilities is in separate schools or separate units. This one has the clearest support for inclusion within regular education settings. And then we have the Dakar Conference that was in 2000. And in particular, it shifted the discourse a bit to not only look at access, but to also look at quality. Because you don't only want children accessing an education, you want them to have access to quality education. So that discourse shifted to looking at achieving quality education for all students in classroom, including those with disabilities. And everybody now is familiar with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And in particular, Article 24 looks at inclusive education. And it says that all people with disabilities have the right to education. And this education should be inclusive at what? All levels, including preschool, primary, secondary, post-secondary. And we've heard that echoed here today. And we've heard the clarion call for all institutions to embrace persons with disabilities. And you can see it goes well beyond secondary to consider post-secondary options as well. Because here in the Caribbean, our post-secondary options tend to be weaker for students with disabilities. In Barbados, for example, after our students have reached that secondary school age, very few of them are really present at the university. We have a small number, usually students with visual impairments. We've had 1 or 2 students who were deaf who managed to access higher education. And in the past, we've had 1 or 2 students with muscular dystrophy or some other type of orthopedic impairment who has managed to access the university education. But again, that's not the norm. That tends to be few and far between. The majority of students actually go on again to access very, very basic training so that they could then go into cottage industries in Barbados. And from my discussions this morning with Lisa, it seems as though that pattern is repeated here in Trinidad and Tobago as well. So when we think about what is the life course for children with disabilities in the Caribbean, if we continue on the pathway that we are on, then it means that many of these students will not have a very fulfilling life after secondary school, because most of them end up where? At home. We also have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. You've also heard about that. We had previous speakers actually allude to the SDGs. And in particular, SDG 4 is very important because it is about ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. And I don't know about you, but when I actually see the work that Nicole is actually doing, I cannot imagine denying students like Nicole and persons like Nicole that opportunity to engage in lifelong learning opportunities and being part of communities and fulfilling their potential. We see the advantages of ensuring that persons like Nicole have that opportunity. She is absolutely amazing to watch. So internationally, and I like to include a look at other contexts as well, so that we could see internationally what the legislative framework actually looks like. And this particular bit of legislation that I have on screen, this particular slide, it looks at court cases in the United States in special education that really pave the way for the types of services and structures that are now in place in the US. And I'll just talk about one critical case that is noted there, one of the landmark cases. That this is the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in Kansas. And in particular, this particular case was tried in the 1950s, and it tackled discrimination in education, and in particular, racial segregation. And at that time, it held that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal for minority students. And it basically set a precedent for marginalized groups like students with disabilities who later were able to argue that their rights were being violated because they had no access to education due to their disability. And that's one of the powers of having legislation in place. You could tackle disability, you could tackle inequality, all right? And this is something that we want to move towards in the Caribbean as well. Presently speaking, in the United States, the key piece of legislation that really governs education is called IDEIA. IDEA. Isn't that not interesting? It's called IDEA. And in particular, IDEA really proposes that students, all students with disabilities, have available to them a free, appropriate public education. Imagine if we had a piece of legislation like that in Caribbean islands that says that all students have the right to a free, appropriate public education. In addition to that, to ensure that the rights of students with disabilities and their guardians are protected, again, that is something that is specified under IDEIA, clearly set out in legislation. In addition to that, IDEIA also states that local education services, agencies, etc., that they are to provide for the education of all students with disabilities. So it clearly establishes whose responsibility it is to provide services for students, clearly set out in law as well. In addition to that, to access and ensure the effectiveness of efforts to educate students with disabilities. So what legislation does, it clearly provides a framework, guidelines that could challenge discrimination, lack of access. It tells you who is responsible for what. So that means what? There's more accountability within the system when legislation clearly specifies what students with disabilities have the right to access. Within our own Caribbean context, we might not have an IDEIA, but we do have Caribbean islands that have really sought to move the ball forward, move the needle forward. One of the Caribbean islands that I like to look at is Jamaica. Now, in 2014, Jamaica signed the Jamaican Disabilities Act, which speaks to the education for persons with disabilities generally. And in particular, they tackle again that whole issue of access, and this is how it is actually stated in their act. An education or training institution shall deny a person with shall not deny a person with a disability from being enrolled at or attending the institution by reason of their disability. So there's legislation that clearly states that institutions cannot discriminate. In addition to that, it also goes on to look at the type of support that students with disabilities must have once they are enrolled at the institution. So reasonable access to education or training, they need to have access to facilities in the least restrictive environment. They also need to have services so they're not placed at a disadvantage. And in addition to that, they must be provided with reasonable arrangement and receive support required to effectively facilitate inclusion. Again, written in law so that we know what students with disabilities have a right to access. Now, we've heard about the national policy that the government of Trinidad and Tobago is trying to actually now move through their particular legislation. And within the Caribbean, and certainly within Barbados, we too have been looking at how to move our policy frameworks forward as well. So this is something that we're grappling with as well. And we heard from the Honorable Minister this morning about what is being done. And it is a wonderful initiative. And I'm hoping that it actually goes through because we understand the importance of that. But we've had and we've heard from our last speaker about the time frame it takes to actually move policy from being just a document to actual legislation. So we know it's a process, and I could tell you in Barbados, it is a process as well. It's taken us really, really long to move that agenda forward as well. I want to say something about what do we know about educating children with Down syndrome and where we are in terms of that. And this is coming again from the perspective of what the research has to say. So if there's anybody who believes that children with Down syndrome should not be in regular education settings, let's look and see what some of the research has to say. And in particular, research by Buckley working in the UK, for example, they argued that inclusion had a positive impact on the achievement of students with Down syndrome. And in particular, their work focused on teenagers at the particular point in time. And what they noticed is that when teens are included in regular education setting, they receive really good gains in communication skills compared to those who are educated in special education settings. And in particular, good gains in expressive language and literacy skills were noted. As well, fewer behavioral challenges were also noted for the students who are included. So real gains. In particular as well, research by Farrager and Clark, and this is working in the Australian context, they also noted good gains for students in terms of mathematics calculation, and this is at the primary level of schooling. And what they suggested in their particular case study is that once you teach students how to actually utilize technology, it has the capacity to close that gap in terms of doing certain types of mathematics calculations, etc. They also recognize that teachers could make curriculum adjustments, and again, with the utilization of technology, doing hands-on materials, etc. These things have the capacity to close that gap so that students with Down syndrome can participate in the regular education curriculum. And we know the importance as well of having learning support. And that was also a key accommodation that needed to be present in order to assist students. So again, yes, we can. So I think if we think about largely what the benefits are generally for inclusion, there are a couple key points that I just want to emphasize. So you've heard again from our speakers today that when we put students with disabilities in regular education classroom, that labeling is de-emphasized, for example. We have opportunities for these students to learn from their peers, and that's something that you heard from Nicole, the importance of social interaction. In addition to that, we also know that when students are included in regular education settings, that resource rooms teachers, they could serve a larger number of students within classrooms as well, and that there are real successes in terms of academic pursuits. And in particular, when you couple that with individualized instruction, you get greater gains as well. There are benefits, believe it or not, for teachers as well. So you get that idea that collaboration becomes really important when you include students with disabilities, because now you have professionals working from various angles, the special education teacher working with the general education teacher. You may have the speech language therapist working with the general education teacher. And again, rationalize your resources, they could serve more students in the classroom. In addition to that, we know that general education teachers, they get to be supported by other professionals. And we also know that special ed teachers, once they are allowed, that they could really help boost the knowledge and skills of students with exceptionalities who are included in the regular education setting. So you could still get that individualization taking place in schools. What we tend to hear more about, especially when you speak to teachers, sometimes tends to be the obstacles associated with inclusion. And yes, parents are ambivalent at times about inclusion. And that's another conversation that needs to be had as well, because it is about whether or not schools are prepared to undertake this journey with these students. Many teachers, as we know, in our context, we still do need to pursue teacher training. That is something the University of the West Indies is working on, training more teachers. Teacher attitudes, and you heard about barriers to participation today. Teacher attitudes can present barriers to participation for students with disabilities. But I think after listening to all the presenters today, all the self-advocates, I think that there isn't anyone here who isn't convinced that this thing called inclusion cannot be done. We know that one thing that we are going to have to tackle in the Caribbean is the lack of resources. Because certainly the research that I did with teachers within the Caribbean classroom, what it showed is that the ambivalence really comes from not knowing where the resources are going to come from to support inclusion. And that's what teachers are really concerned about. And we also need to think about the policies set by the ministry around inclusion that sometimes lag behind the calls for inclusive education. And you could see that's been decades away. So what are the key takeaways around inclusion? So inclusive education, yes, it demands that teachers view all students as their responsibility. That's the first thing. Teacher attitudes is the linchpin that's going to determine the success of inclusion. That, as well as principals and how principals view inclusion and their responsibility to bring inclusive cultures into their schools and just take responsibility for that. Inclusion accrues benefits for students with Down syndrome, but we also need to make sure that when they do need to have those individualized supports, those need to be available. And certainly, when we look at the international conventions, when we think about the policy initiatives, there is broad agreement that education is a fundamental right, and therefore providing those equitable, inclusive education and opportunities must be buttressed by legislation to ensure that no child is left behind. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.